One of the things we'll be talking about is banking for cannabis-related businesses, and there's two categories to that. There's depositor relations for the banking, and then there's lending. And so currently, the last report from FinCEN, there were 684 banks listed on their website as they're currently active in the sector. And that number represents about 15% of all banks in the country. So I think it's important to know that there's more robust banking than most people think. And the issue is that their cash buildup that you get in the industry is not because there's not banking. It's because that you cannot process credit cards on the federal system. And thus people have to pay with cash at the dispensaries, and then they have to deposit that. The other side of that is lending. And of those 684 banks, we've heard as many as 400 have lent in the sector. We're tracking at least 4 dozen. And so there are federally chartered, state chartered, and community banks that are actively lending in this sector. So there is banking for deposit relations, there is banking for lending, and it does exist. It's just when you start getting more nuanced in it and understanding the lending, that's when it gets a little bit more complicated. The banks are more willing to lend on dispensaries, which are typically in urban environments, whereas you start to become more specialty use lending for larger cultivation facilities. That's where the banks just really don't understand those types of properties or how to evaluate those. So most people don't realize that in cannabis-related business banking or CRB banking, there's different tiers that were established for this industry. Tier 1 is plant touching, and that's the most highest scrutiny of underwriting for the know your customer for that particular bank. And those depositors can deposit cash, and they can also do wires and regular checking and banking as well. So that does exist. The next tier is called tier 2/3, which is ancillary. And it still has to go through know your customer just like any other bank account. But it just basically says that you're associated or you have the majority of your revenue, like us, is generated from a business that is ancillary to or directly involved in cannabis. So those are the tiers, and not to be confused with a lot of people consider MSOs and certain levels of tiers. We're not talking about that. We're talking banking tiers, and this was established for the banking guidelines. With the proposed passage of safe banking, we're still trying to understand how that will change the landscape of banking. And we do believe that if and when it does pass, whether it's safe banking or some other form that deconflicts state policy from federal policy, that banking will be more easily accessible for cannabis related businesses. What we're still trying to understand is, the states have their own compliance for these license holders. And so by the feds, this law passing or whatever, this amendment that would pass, how does this change it for the state compliance? Will the banks still have to go through the state compliance and follow that process from the state level? Or is this now, because you've removed it from anti-money laundering and from the other aspects that were problematic, does that resolve it? So these are all things that we don't know of how this legislation, if it passes, will change things for the banking relationships. But one of the things I will say is that you have a morality issue for banks as well. Just because a bank can be in a sector doesn't mean they're ready and willing to go into that sector. So you have that choke point as well, that we could see legislation pass, but we might not see a whole lot of new banks enter into the sector. What most people wouldn't know, because they're not cannabis related depositors, is that when you do become a cannabis related business depositor, to offset the additional compliance and the fees that the bank has to go through, they either will charge higher fees. They may charge a higher fee to deposit your money. That's pretty much doesn't happen that much anymore that I'm aware of. But usually that they would do is they require a minimum level of deposits at all times. And that's not different than traditional banking relationships, but these deposits might be higher. The good thing is as we're going through the macro banking environment of these community and smaller banks having more difficulty maintaining deposits, the cannabis friendly banks have a built-in depositor base that can't move to go somewhere else. Now, interestingly enough, First Republic and Signature Bank were both cannabis-friendly deposit banks, but they were very de minimis from what we understand of how many depositors were there for cannabis-related depositors. Our bank is a fairly decent-sized bank for cannabis and focused on it. And many SVB depositors did go to our bank, and our bank happens to have insurance above and beyond the 250,000 depositor FDIC limit that is for most banks. So it's interesting that most people don't know that there are other programs. Our bank insures up to 1.5 billion.